There comes a moment in every parent's life when they realize their children won't carry on their name or their dreams. For some, it's a gentle acceptance. For others, it's a wound that never heals. Lord Everen walks his empty estate knowing he will be the last of his line. His son died in a war that meant nothing, and his grand manor will crumble into dust with no heir to remember his name. Then he meets Liora, a peasant girl caring for her dying mother with more grace than all the nobility he's known. He offers her education, a place in his household, something beyond charity. The local gentry call it madness. But sometimes the most important legacy isn't blood, it's the lives we choose to change. Can an old man's final act create something that outlasts kingdoms? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Thornfield Estate like ghosts reluctant to depart, much like the memories that haunted its master. Lord Everen Ashworth stood at the tall windows of his study, watching the sun struggle through the gray English sky of 1768. At 73, his frame still carried the dignity of his noble bearing, though his shoulders had begun to curve inward as if the weight of solitude had finally found its mark. His fingers traced the edge of the mahogany desk, where a single object commanded attention among the neat stacks of estate papers, a military. Metal, bronze and tarnished, its ribbon faded from crimson to the color of dried roses. Marcus's medal. The Victoria Cross his son would never wear again. 3 years, Everen whispered to the empty room, his voice carrying the practiced cadence of a man who had grown accustomed to being his own audience. 3 years since the messenger had arrived with news from the American colonies. 3 years since the word fallen had transformed from something that happened to other families into the defining fact of his existence. The estate stretched beyond his windows like a kingdom in miniature 1,200 acres of prime English countryside, dotted with tenant cottages whose chimneys sent lazy columns of smoke into the morning air. Once, this view had filled him with pride. Now it felt like looking upon a monument to futility. What was the point of legacy without an heir to inherit it? What was the meaning of building something magnificent if it would only crumble when its last guardian departed? Everen turned from the window and moved through the great house with the measured steps of ritual. 23 rooms echoed his footfalls, each space maintained in perfect order by a staff that had learned to work around their master's increasing need for solitude. The grand staircase swept upward beneath portraits of dead Ashworths, men and women whose names were carved in marble and whose bloodline would end with him. Eleanor smiled down from her portrait in the main hall. Forever 35, forever. Beautiful, forever frozen in the moment before consumption had claimed her voice. Then her breath, then her life. She had been gone for 15 years now. But some mornings, Everen still reached across the bed, expecting to find her warmth. The heart, he had learned, was remarkably stubborn in its refusal to accept reality. "Good morning, my lord." Mrs. Hartwell, his housekeeper, appeared with the timing that comes from 3 decades of service. She was one of the few souls brave enough to speak to him before his second cup of tea. "Cook has prepared your usual breakfast." "Thank you, Mrs. Hartwell." Everen accepted the routine with the gratitude of a drowning man accepting a rope. Structure was what kept him from drifting entirely into the gray spaces where grief lived. "And the estate reports?" "On your desk, my lord." Mr. Blackwood noted some concern about the northern cottages, the Whitmore family's roof once mending before winter, and young Mrs. Fletcherwell. She's struggling since her husband's passing. These were the details that once would have commanded his immediate attention. Now they felt like stones in his pockets, small weights that reminded him of responsibilities he no longer felt equipped to bear. What wisdom could a childless man offer to struggling families? What comfort could he provide when his own heart remained a barren field? The dining room table could seat 20, but Everen took his customary place at one end, reading estate papers, while cutting his breakfast with mechanical precision. The silence had weight here, pressing down like a physical thing. Once, this table had hosted elaborate dinner parties where Eleanor's laughter had been the finest music, where Marcus had regaled guests with stories from Oxford, where the future had seemed as abundant as the crystal and silver that caught candlelight and threw it back in brilliant fragments. Now the silence was absolute except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, marking time toward an end that held no promise of renewal. After breakfast, Everen followed his daily route through the estate. The stables housed horses that had once carried him and Marcus on morning rides across the countryside. The library contained first editions and rare manuscripts that had been intended as Marcus's inheritance, books on history and philosophy, and law that would have prepared him for the responsibilities of lordship. The conservatory held Eleanor's piano, its keys yellow with age, the music long since fled from its strings. Each space was a museum of might-have-been, preserved with the desperate hope that somehow, if everything remained exactly as it was, time might reverse itself and bring back what had been lost. But as Everen walked the grounds that afternoon, something caught his attention that had never been there before. A thin column of smoke rising from one of the most distant cottages, a place he had believed empty. The Bramble Cottage, they called it, set at the very edge of his property, where the manicured grounds gave way to wild hedgerow and untended field. It had been vacant for as long as he could remember, deemed too isolated and too humble for any of his tenants. Yet someone was there now. Curiosity, an emotion he had thought dead within him, stirred like a seed responding to unexpected rain. For the first time in months, Lord Everen Ashworth felt compelled to investigate something beyond the boundaries of his carefully ordered grief. He set out across the field, his walking stick tapping against the hard ground, following the smoke, like a sign pointing toward an unknown destination. As he drew closer to the cottage, he could hear something that made him pause, a voice, clear and strong, singing an old ballad he recognized from his childhood. The voice was young, female, and filled with a vitality that seemed to make the very air around the cottage pulse with life. After so many years of silence, the sound struck him as forcefully as a bell tolling in an empty cathedral. The cottage itself was humble almost to the point of poverty. Stone walls darkened with age, a thatched roof that had seen better decades. Windows so small they seemed to squint at the world. But someone had made efforts at improvement. The dooryard was swept clean. Herbs grew in neat rows along the south wall, and curtains plain but spotless hung in the windows. Everen approached the door with the uncertainty of a man who had forgotten how to make unannounced social calls. His world had become so circumscribed by routine and solitude that the simple act of knocking on a door felt momentous. Yet something about the singing voice, something about the life emanating from this forgotten corner of his estate, compelled him forward. He raised his hand to knock, and in that moment, everything that would follow began. The knock that answered his own was not what Everen expected. Instead of the deferential response he had grown accustomed to from his tenants, the door opened to reveal a young woman who looked at him with eyes that held no trace of subservience. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair pulled back in a practical braid and hands that spoke of honest work. Her dress was simple homespun, mended in places but clean, and she carried herself with a dignity that seemed to transform the humble doorway into something approaching regal. "Yes," she said, not unkindly, but without the bowing and scraping that usually accompanied his presence. Her voice was the same one he had heard singing clear and strong, with an accent that marked her as local, but refined by some education he could not immediately place. "I am Lord Ashworth," he began, then found himself uncertain how to continue. It had been so long since he had introduced himself to a stranger. "I own this estate. I know who you are." Her response was matter-of-fact rather than confrontational. "I'm Liora Hayes. This is my mother's cottage, or was, before she took ill. We've been here for 3 weeks now. I wasn't aware anyone had taken residence here." "No one asked permission, if that's what you mean." She stepped slightly forward, and he caught the scent of herbs, rosemary and lavender, and something medicinal he couldn't identify. "We needed shelter, and the cottage was empty. My mother is dying, and she needed somewhere peaceful to do it." The directness of her statement hit him like cold water. In his world, death was discussed in euphemisms, approached sideways through careful language that softened its edges. But this young woman spoke of it as simply as she might mention the weather, and somehow her honesty felt like a gift. "I see," he said, though he wasn't certain he did. "And you are caring for her alone?" "I." She studied his face with an intensity that made him feel as if she were taking his measure. "She raised me alone after my father died. It seems only fitting that I should return the favor." From inside the cottage came a weak voice calling Liora, and the young woman's entire demeanor shifted. The wariness melted away, replaced by a tenderness so profound it was almost painful to witness. "Coming, Mama," she called back, then looked at Everen again. "If you've come to evict us, I'd ask that you wait until she's gone. It won't be long now." The assumption stung, partly because it was exactly what he should have done. An unauthorized tenant was a clear violation of proper estate management. But something about her fierce protectiveness, something about the way she spoke of her mother's, approaching death with such clear-eyed love, made the thought of eviction seem not just cruel, but impossible. "May I see her?" he heard himself ask, surprising them both. Liora's eyebrows rose. "You want to meet a dying peasant woman?" "I want to understand who has come to live on my land." She considered this for a long moment, searching his face for some sign of his intentions. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she stepped back from the doorway. "Very well. But she tires easily, and she doesn't need the stress of bowing and scraping to nobility. Can you speak to her as you would to any person?" The question was almost insulting in its implication, yet Everen found himself nodding. "I believe I can manage that." The interior of the cottage was spotless despite its obvious poverty. A fire burned in the small hearth, filling the space with warmth and the scent of herbs. The main room served as kitchen, sitting area, and sick room, with a bed positioned near the window, where an elderly woman lay propped up on pillows. Her face was drawn with illness, but her eyes were bright and intelligent. The same eyes, Everen realized, that looked out from her daughter's face. "Mama, this is Lord Ashworth," Liora said, settling beside the bed with practiced ease. "He owns the estate, my lord." The woman's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried warmth. "I'm Margaret Hayes. I hope we haven't caused offense by sheltering here." Everen found himself moving closer to the bed, drawn by something in her manner. "Not at all, Mrs. Hayes. Your daughter tells me you're not well." "Dying, she means," Margaret said with a small smile that reminded him startlingly of Eleanor's. Humor in the face of her own illness. Though Liora prefers gentler words. "She's made this old cottage into a palace for me, my lord. I've never been more comfortable in my life." Looking around the small space, Everen could see evidence of Liora's care everywhere. Wildflowers in a chipped vase, herbs hanging from the rafters to dry, a small table beside the bed holding bottles and jars of what he assumed were medicines. On the windowsill sat a collection of stones, worn smooth by water, arranged with the care one might give to precious gems. "Those are from the stream where I played as a child," Margaret explained, following his gaze. "Liora brought them to me when I told her I wanted to remember running water. She has a gift for knowing what the heart needs." Everen looked at the young woman who was adjusting her mother's pillows with infinite gentleness. There was something about her presence, something about the quality of attention she gave to each small task, That reminded him of the person he had once been before grief had carved out so much of his capacity for caring. "You mentioned that she has some education," he said. "Where did she receive it?" The parson's wife took an interest when Liora was small, Margaret replied. Taught her letters and numbers, a bit of Latin even. Said it was a sin to waste such a mind on ignorance. Liora reads everything she can find. I see. Everen studied the young woman, noting the way she listened to their conversation while continuing her careful ministrations. "And what do you read, Miss Hayes?" "Whatever I can find," she replied without looking up from her work. The parson had some book sermons mostly, but also poetry. There was a copy of Pilgrim's Progress and some of Mr. Pope's verses. I read them until I had them by heart. "And what did you think of Mr. Pope?" Now she did look at him, and he saw a spark of interest kindle in her eyes. "I think he had clever words for cruel truths. The proper study of mankind is man," he wrote, but then he spent most of his time making sport of human folly. It's easy enough to mock people's weaknesses. It takes more courage to find their strengths. The answer surprised him with its sophistication. This was not the response he would have expected from a peasant girl, however educated. There was a depth to her thinking, a moral seriousness that spoke of a mind capable of far more than her circumstances have allowed. You disagree with his assessment of human nature? I think people are capable of both great good and great harm, she said simply. The difference usually comes down to what life has taught them to expect from the world. Show someone kindness, and they're more likely to be kind. Show them cruelty, and they learn to be cruel in return. Margaret Hayes watched this exchange with the satisfied expression of a mother seeing her child shine. She has opinions about everything, my lord. Always has, since she was tiny. I used to worry it would get her in trouble. And has it? Everen asked Liora directly. Sometimes, she admitted with a slight smile. But I'd rather be in trouble for speaking truth than safe for holding my tongue. There was something in that statement, some quality of fearless honesty, that pierced through the careful walls Everen had built around his heart. When was the last time anyone had spoken to him with such unguarded directness? When was the last time he had encountered someone who seemed more interested in truth than in managing his opinion of them? "Your daughter is remarkable, Mrs. Hayes," he said, meaning it completely. "She is," Margaret agreed, reaching out to touch Liora's hand. "And she deserves better than watching me waste away in this cottage. But she won't leave me, no matter how I argue." "There's nowhere to go, Mama, and nothing more important than being here with you," Liora said firmly. "We've managed well enough so far." Looking at the sparse furnishings, the carefully rationed medicines, the obvious signs of poverty born with dignity, Everen doubted they had managed as well as she claimed. Yet there was something in this cottage, some quality of love and care and uncompromising honesty that made his grand manor feel empty by comparison. For the first time in years, Lord Everen Ashworth found himself in the presence of something that mattered more than grief. Everen found himself returning to the cottage the following day, then again the day after that. At first, he told himself he was simply fulfilling his obligations as landlord, checking on unauthorized tenants, ensuring they posed no threat to his property. But if he were honest, and these visits were teaching him to be honest with himself again, it came because the cottage had become the only place on his estate where he felt truly alive. Margaret Hayes received his visits with gentle gratitude, but it was Liora who fascinated him. She moved through her days with a purposefulness he had forgotten was possible, every action directed towards some meaningful end. When she wasn't tending to her mother's needs, she was foraging for medicinal herbs, mending their few possessions, or reading aloud from a small, worn volume that Everen eventually recognized as her mother's prayer book. The book itself was a humble thing, leather binding cracked with age, pages yellowed and soft from countless handlings, but Margaret treasured it above all her possessions. and Everen often found her with it pressed against her chest when she slept, as if drawing comfort from its familiar weight. "It was my grandmother's," Liora explained one afternoon when she caught him looking at it, "and her grandmother's before that. The words have been worn smooth by generations of women finding solace in them. You read to her from it every evening. She likes to hear the familiar passages. They connect her to all the women who came before, all the mothers and daughters who found strength in the same words." Liora's fingers traced the book's worn spine with reverence. "When I read them aloud, I can feel them all listening, the whole line of women who loved and worried and hoped and endured." There was something in her voice, some quality of deep connection to the past, that made Everen think of his own family's legacy in a new light. He had always conceived of inheritance in terms of property and title, but Liora spoke of a different kind of legacy, one passed down through stories and values, through the accumulated wisdom of generations who had faced hardship and found ways to persist. "Your mother raised you to think deeply about such things," he observed. "My mother raised me to think, period," Liora replied with a smile. "She said ignorance was a luxury we couldn't afford. Poor people have to understand the world clearly because we don't have the cushion of wealth to protect us from our mistakes." The comment was delivered without bitterness, but it struck Everen forcefully. How often had his own wealth and position allowed him to remain blind to uncomfortable truths? How many times had he made decisions without fully considering their consequences, because he knew others would bear the cost of his errors? "That's a harsh but fair assessment," he said. "It's not harsh if it's true," Liora replied, then softened her tone. "Though I don't mean it as criticism of you personally, my lord. You seem different from what I expected of nobility." "Different? How?" "You listen when people speak. You ask questions as if the answers matter to you. Most of the gentry I've encountered seem to hear only what confirms what they already believe." It was a perceptive observation, and one that made Everen uncomfortable in the way that truth often does. How many times had he dismissed the concerns of his tenants without truly hearing them? How often had he allowed his assumptions about their lives to substitute for actual knowledge? "Perhaps I've learned the value of listening only recently," he admitted. "Grief has a way of stripping away pretense," Margaret said softly from her bed. She had been so quiet that Everen had thought her asleep, but her eyes were alert and knowing. "It makes us see clearly, sometimes for the first time." The observation was so accurate, it was almost painful. Grief had indeed stripped away many of his comfortable illusions, leaving him exposed to realities he had previously managed to avoid. But it had also, he was beginning to realize, opened him to possibilities he had never considered. "Mrs. Hayes, may I ask you something?" he said, moving closer to her bed. "Of course, my lord. You're facing death with such grace, such acceptance. How do you manage it?" "I've known grief, but I've never faced my own mortality with such equanimity." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on something beyond the small window. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "I think it's because I know my life mattered," she said finally. "Not in any grand way that history will remember, but in the small ways that matter most. I raised a daughter who's good and strong and thoughtful. I showed her how to care for others, how to find beauty in simple things, how to face hardship without losing hope. When I die, those lessons will continue through her and someday through her children if she's blessed with them." She turned her gaze to Everen, and he saw in her eyes a clarity that seemed almost luminous. "The tragedy isn't dying, my lord. The tragedy is living without knowing that your life has meaning. You've lost your son, and I know that pain goes deeper than anything I can imagine. But surely his life had meaning? Surely he left something behind that continues?" The question pierced straight through to the heart of Everen's grief. Marcus had indeed left things behind, memories of his laughter, evidence of his kind nature, the respect of his tutors and friends. But Everen had been so focused on what was lost that he had barely considered what remained. He did, he said quietly. He was a good man. Kind, thoughtful, full of ideas about how to improve the estate for everyone who depended on it. Then his legacy lives, Margaret said simply. Not in the form you expected, perhaps, but in the values he embodied. Those don't die with the body, my lord. They continue in everyone who is touched by them. Liora had been listening to this exchange with obvious emotion, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Mama has always been wise about such things, she said. She taught me that legacy isn't about monuments or grand gestures. It's about the daily choice to make the world a little better than we found it. And you've learned that lesson well, Everen replied, struck by the truth of it. In just the few days he had been visiting the cottage, he had watched Liora transform the humble space into something approaching beautiful. She had planted a small garden, organized their meager possessions with aesthetic care, and created an atmosphere of peace and contentment that made the cottage feel more welcoming than his grand manor. "What will you do?" he asked carefully, when afterward. Liora's composure flickered for just a moment before she regained it. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have no family left, no particular skills that would earn me employment in a great house. I suppose I'll make my way as best I can." The matter-of-fact way she stated this, the absence of self-pity or dramatic despair, impressed him deeply. Here was someone facing an uncertain future with courage and dignity, while he had spent 3 years wallowing in his certainties. "You have considerable skills," he said. "You read and write well. You have a gift for creating beauty from simple materials, and you possess more wisdom than many people twice your age. Those are not insignificant assets." "Kind of you to say, my lord, but wisdom doesn't put food on the table." "Perhaps not directly," he replied, an idea beginning to form in his mind. "But it might open doors you haven't considered." That evening, as Everen walked back to the manor through the gathering dusk, his mind was more active than it had been in months. For the first time since Marcus's death, he found himself thinking about the future rather than dwelling on the past. The cottage visits had awakened something in him, not happiness exactly, but a sense of purpose he had thought lost forever. Margaret Hayes was dying with dignity because she knew her life had mattered. Her daughter faced an uncertain future with courage because she had been taught that adversity was something to be met with grace rather than bitterness. Both women possessed a kind of nobility that had nothing to do with birth or title and everything to do with character. And for the first time in 3 years, Lord Everen Ashworth began to wonder if there might be ways to create meaning beyond bloodline, legacy beyond inheritance, and hope beyond the grave. The chess set had belonged to Marcus, carved from English oak by a craftsman in the village. It was simple in design, but elegant in its proportions, each piece worn smooth by years of handling during their evening games. Everen had not touched it since his son's death, unable to bear the memories it evoked. But something about his conversations with Liora, her quick mind and love of intellectual challenge made him think the set might serve a purpose beyond gathering dust. He brought it to the cottage on a gray Thursday morning, feeling oddly nervous about the gesture. Liora was hanging herbs to dry from the cottage's low rafters, and Margaret was propped up in bed, looking frailer than she had the day before, but alert and welcoming. "I thought you might enjoy this," he said, setting the chess set on the small table near Margaret's bed. "If you know the game." Liora paused in her work, her eyes fixed on the carved pieces with obvious interest. "I know the moves, but I've never had anyone to play with. The parson's wife tried to teach me once, but she found my questions tiresome." "What sort of questions?" Everen asked, genuinely curious. "About why the queen is the most powerful piece when queens in reality have so little actual power. About whether the pawns ever resent being sacrificed for the greater good. About what happens to the pieces after the game ends. She gave a slight shrug, as if embarrassed by her own curiosity. She said I was being fanciful. I think you were being thoughtful, Everen replied, beginning to arrange the pieces on the board. Chess is a game about power and strategy, but also about sacrifice and consequence. Your questions go to the heart of what makes it interesting. Margaret watched from her bed as they settled into chairs on opposite sides of the small table. She's always been like that, she said with fond pride. Even as a child, she wanted to understand not just what was happening, but why it mattered. The first game revealed immediately that Liora had understated her abilities. While she lacked experience with advanced strategies, she possessed an intuitive grasp of the game's underlying principles. She saw patterns quickly, anticipated consequences several moves ahead, and displayed a caution that suggested she understood the value of patience over aggression. "You're holding back," Everen observed after she had declined an aggressive attack that might have given her a temporary advantage. "I'm thinking," she replied, studying the board intently. "You have more experience than I do, which means you probably see traps I'm missing. Better to play defensively until I understand your patterns." It was a mature strategic approach, one that many experienced players never learned. Everen found himself genuinely challenged for the first time in years, forced to think carefully about each move rather than relying on familiar patterns. "Check," Liora announced quietly, advancing her queen in a move he hadn't anticipated. He studied the board with new respect, seeing how she had maneuvered him into a position that left him few good options. "Well played. I didn't see that developing." "You taught me that in our conversation yesterday," she said, not boasting but explaining. "You said that real power often works indirectly, through influence rather than force." I started thinking about how the queen might work that way too. The insight impressed him deeply. She had taken an abstract concept from their philosophical discussions and applied it practically to the game, showing the kind of intellectual flexibility that marked truly gifted minds. Over the following weeks, their chess matches became a daily ritual. Everen would arrive mid-morning, spend time talking with Margaret about her needs and the progression of her illness, then settle in for increasingly complex games with Liora. Her improvement was remarkable. Within days, she was winning as often as she lost, and her questions about strategy had evolved into sophisticated discussions about human nature and leadership. "In chess, you sacrifice pieces for the greater good of winning the game," she observed during one particularly intense match. "But in life, how do you decide when sacrifice is justified? When does the greater good become an excuse for accepting preventable suffering?" The question struck him as remarkably sophisticated for someone of her background. What prompted that thought? "I was thinking about my father," she said, moving her bishop to protect her king. "He died working in the mines, along with 7 other men, because the owner refused to spend money on better supports. The owner said it would have been too expensive, that the mine wouldn't be profitable if they had to ensure perfect safety. He sacrificed 8 men for what he called the greater good of keeping the mine running and the other workers employed. And, you disagree with his reasoning?" "I think he sacrificed other people's lives for his own profit and called it virtue." Her voice was calm but firm. "True sacrifice involves giving up something of your own, not deciding that someone else should pay the cost for your choices." The distinction was one that cut to the heart of moral reasoning, and Everen found himself reconsidering many decisions he had made over the years. How often had he framed his choices in terms of the greater good while ensuring that he personally bore little of the cost? "That's a fair criticism of how power often operates," he said. "Those who make decisions about sacrifice rarely have to bear its consequences themselves. Which is why I think the powerful have an obligation to be especially careful," Liora replied, castling her king to safety. "The greater your ability to affect other people's lives, the more thoughtful you should be about how you use that ability. These conversations, conducted over the chessboard while Margaret dozed or listened with obvious pleasure, became the highlight of Everen's days. For the first time since Marcus's death, he felt mentally stimulated, challenged to defend his ideas and consider new perspectives. Liora's mind was like a precision instrument, sharp, careful, and unafraid to examine difficult questions. But the chess games also revealed something else: Liora's hunger for intellectual engagement. She absorbed new concepts with obvious delight, building on them with insights that surprised even herself. Watching her discover her own capabilities was like watching someone uncover a treasure they had never known they possessed. "You have a remarkable mind," he told her one afternoon after she had executed a particularly elegant combination that had caught him completely off guard. "It's a tragedy that circumstances have given you so few opportunities to develop it." "I'm grateful for the opportunities I've had," she replied, though he could see in her eyes that his comment had touched something deep. "The parson's wife, my mother's wisdom, these conversations with you, they've all been gifts I never expected. But imagine what you might accomplish with real education. University-level instruction in philosophy, history, literature, mathematics. Your mind is capable of so much more than circumstances have allowed." For a moment, her carefully maintained composure slipped, and he saw a flash of something that might have been longing. But she quickly recovered her equilibrium. "People like me don't receive university educations, my lord. We make do with what we can find and try to use it well." The resignation in her voice troubled him deeply. Here was someone with the intellectual gifts to match any scholar he had known, condemned by accident of birth to a life that would never fully utilize her abilities. It seemed not just unfair but wasteful a squandering of human potential that served no one's interests. That night, as he sat in his study surrounded by books that Marcus would never read, Everen found himself thinking about waste and possibility in ways he hadn't considered before. His son was gone, and with him the future that Everen had so carefully planned. But what if there were other ways to create meaning, other forms of legacy that didn't depend on blood inheritance? What if the most important thing he could pass on wasn't property or title, but opportunity itself? The writing desk had been Eleanor's, crafted of rosewood with delicate brass fittings and compartments sized perfectly for a lady's correspondence. It had sat unused in her former sitting room for 15 years, gathering dust like so many other remnants of his previous life. But when Everen decided to make his extraordinary offer to Liora, he knew that symbols mattered. Moving the desk to her cottage would announce his intentions more clearly than any words. "I have a proposal to make," he said on a morning when Margaret seemed particularly fragile, and Liora was grinding herbs with the mechanical precision of someone trying to keep worry at bay. "I would like to provide you with a formal education." Liora's hands stilled on the pestle. "My lord, you have a mind capable of far more than circumstances have allowed. I have resources that are going unused, a library full of books, knowledge gained through years of study, connections to tutors and scholars. It seems wasteful for both of us to continue as we are when we might benefit each other." Margaret had opened her eyes at the sound of their voices, and now she watched the exchange with keen attention. Liora looked between them, her expression carefully neutral in the way Everen had learned meant she was thinking rapidly. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. "That I arrange for your education in the same subjects my son would have studied. History, philosophy, mathematics, Latin, French if you're interested, literature and rhetoric. The foundations of what people call a gentleman's education, though I see no reason why a woman of intelligence shouldn't receive the same." The silence that followed was profound. Margaret's breathing seemed to pause, and even the cottage's usual sounds, the tick of the small clock, the whisper of wind through the thatch, seemed to fade into expectant quiet. And in return, Liora asked, her voice carefully controlled. Nothing, Everen replied, and saw her eyebrows rise in skepticism. Or rather, nothing beyond the pleasure of seeing a fine mind properly developed. I'm not seeking a governess or a companion or... He paused, realizing how his offer might be misconstrued. I'm a lonely old man who has discovered that teaching brings him joy. Your education would be its own reward. My lord, Margaret said softly, that's extraordinarily generous, but surely you understand how such an arrangement would appear to others. He did understand, and the understanding troubled him deeply. A 73-year-old lord providing private education to a beautiful young peasant woman would inevitably be viewed through the lens of impropriety, regardless of his actual intentions. The gossip alone could ruin Liora's reputation and make her future more difficult, not less. I've considered that, he said, which is why I propose to make the arrangement as public and respectable as possible. The desk there, he gestured toward the rosewood writing desk that two of his footmen had delivered that morning. It belonged to my late wife. It will serve as your study space, and our lessons will take place here in your mother's presence, or in my library with Mrs. Hartwell. As chaperone, everything will be conducted with complete propriety. Liora ran her fingers along the desk's polished surface, her expression unreadable. This is beautiful, she said quietly, and far too valuable for a cottage like this. Its value lies in being used for learning, Everen replied. It's been gathering dust for 15 years. Better to serve its purpose here than remain a mere monument in an empty room. The village will talk, Liora said, still touching the desk as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. Lord Ashworth's charity case, they'll call me. Or worse things. Let them talk, Margaret said with surprising firmness. Child, you've dreamed of education your entire life. When God opens a door, you don't refuse to walk through it because you're worried about what the neighbors might say. But Everen could see that Liora's concerns went deeper than mere gossip. She was thinking, as she always did, about consequences and complications he might not have considered. What happens when my education is complete? She asked. I'll be neither fish nor fowl, too educated for my birth, too baseborn for the society you move in. Where does such a person fit in the world? It was a penetrating question, one that revealed her understanding of the social realities they would be challenging. Education might enlarge her mind, but it could also make her life more difficult by placing her between worlds that didn't traditionally communicate. I don't know, he admitted, but I suspect that someone with your intelligence and character will find ways to create her own place in the world. The alternative, leaving your abilities undeveloped, seems far worse than the uncertainty of an unconventional path, and you truly expect nothing in return. I expect the satisfaction of seeing you flourish, he said simply. After 3 years of feeling useless, of questioning whether my life has any remaining purpose, you've given me something meaningful to do. That alone is payment beyond price. Liora was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving between the elegant desk and her mother's encouraging face. When she spoke, her voice was steady but emotional. I accept, she said, with gratitude and awareness of what a precious gift this is. I won't waste it. I never imagined you would, Everen replied, feeling a surge of excitement he hadn't experienced since Marcus was young and eager to learn. We'll start tomorrow if your mother doesn't mind sharing your time. My mind sharing her time? Margaret laughed, the sound surprisingly strong. My lord, this is the answer to every prayer I've offered for her future. If I live long enough to see her reading philosophy and discussing great ideas, I'll count myself blessed beyond measure. Over the following days, Everen threw himself into the task of designing Liora's curriculum with an energy that surprised him. He selected books from his library, planned lessons that would challenge without overwhelming, and arranged for special materials, quality paper, proper ink, maps and charts that would bring distant places and historical periods to life. The transformation of the cottage was remarkable. The rosewood desk dominated the small space like a declaration of intent, covered each day with books and papers that marked Liora's rapid progress. Her handwriting, already neat, became elegant under his instruction. Her Latin vocabulary expanded with impressive speed. Her essays on historical topics revealed insights that would have impressed university professors, but it was the philosophical discussions that truly revealed her gifts. Everen would present her with ethical dilemmas, historical controversies, questions about justice and governance that had puzzled scholars for centuries. Her responses were never predictable, often approaching familiar problems from angles that illuminated aspects he had never considered. If a ruler's primary obligation is to his people's welfare, she wrote in one essay, then doesn't that sometimes require him to act against their immediate wishes? A parent doesn't allow a child to eat only sweets, even if that's what the child wants. But unlike children, adults have the right to make poor choices. Where's the line between protection and tyranny? Reading her work, Everen felt the particular joy that comes from watching a brilliant mind discover its own capabilities. But he also began to notice something else. The way other people responded to the changes at the cottage stopped Mrs. Hartwell, who chaperoned many of their library sessions, initially approached the arrangement with obvious skepticism. But within weeks, she was lingering after lessons to hear Liora's discussions, clearly fascinated by perspectives she had never encountered. "She asks questions that would never occur to me," Mrs. Hartwell confided to Everen one afternoon. "Yesterday, she wondered why we call it natural law if it has to be taught to every generation. Said, if it were truly natural, wouldn't children be born knowing it? Made me think about things I'd always taken for granted." But not all reactions were positive. Mr. Blackwood, Everen's estate manager, was clearly uncomfortable with the arrangement, though he was too diplomatic to voice direct criticism. The village doctor, who had begun calling on Margaret more frequently, seemed torn between admiration for Liora's intelligence and concern about the propriety of her situation. And then there were the letters. 3 had arrived within the past fortnight, all from distant relatives who had somehow learned of his unconventional charity project. Cousins and second cousins who had barely acknowledged his existence while Marcus was alive now wrote expressing concern about his decisions, offering gentle suggestions that a man his age might be vulnerable to exploitation by clever young women. The implications stung, partly because he wondered if there might be some truth to them. Was he being manipulated by an attractive young woman who understood exactly how to appeal to a lonely old man's vanity? The thought troubled him deeply, not because he believed it, but because he knew others would. Yet every day with Liora provided fresh evidence that her gratitude was genuine, her dedication to learning absolute, and her character as solid as he had initially believed. She pushed herself harder than he pushed her, staying up late to master difficult concepts, asking for additional assignments when she completed her regular work. Ahead of schedule. The question wasn't whether she was worthy of his investment. The question was whether he was strong enough to weather the storm of criticism that was clearly gathering on the horizon. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by special courier and bearing the seal of the Ashworth family's distant relations. Everen recognized the heavy paper and formal script before he even broke the wax. It was from his second cousin Reginald, a pompous man who had inherited a respectable estate in Derbyshire and considered himself an authority on proper conduct. "My dear cousin," the letter began, "it has come to my attention through various sources that you have taken an unusual interest in the education of a young peasant woman residing on your estate. While I'm certain your intentions are entirely charitable, I feel compelled as a member of your family to express some concerns about how such an arrangement might be perceived by society." Everen set the letter aside without finishing it, his appetite for breakfast suddenly gone. He had expected this, but the reality of it settling upon him felt heavier than anticipated. The village gossip had spread beyond his borders, carrying word of his unconventional project to exactly the people whose opinions could cause real damage to both his reputation and Liora's future. Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral in a way that suggested she had news he wouldn't want to hear. "There are visitors, my lord." Lord and Lady Pemberton, along with their daughter, Miss Catherine. They say they're paying a social call, but they arrived without sending word ahead. The Pembertons. Everen suppressed a groan. They were precisely the sort of people who specialized in monitoring the conduct of their social equals, always ready to offer guidance to those who might be straying from acceptable behavior. Lady Pemberton, in particular, was known throughout the county for her ability to deliver cunning observations while maintaining an expression of sweet concern. "Show them to the morning room," he said with resignation. "I'll join them shortly." But first, he needed to finish Reginald's letter. The remaining paragraphs were predictably condescending, full of gentle suggestions about the dangers of being taken advantage of by those skilled in appealing to the better nature of generous gentlemen. The letter concluded with an offer to visit and provide fraternal guidance in resolving what Reginald clearly considered an embarrassing situation. The morning room felt oppressive when Everen entered it. Lord Pemberton, a man whose primary accomplishment seemed to be inheriting wealth, stood by the window making disapproving observations about the estate's maintenance. Lady Pemberton held court from the best chair, her sharp eyes cataloging every detail of the room's furnishings as if gathering evidence. Their daughter, Catherine, a plain girl of perhaps 25, sat rigidly upright with the expression of someone attending a funeral. "Everen, how good to see you looking so well," Lady Pemberton said with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "We were just saying how concerned we've all been about you since your loss. Grief can make even the strongest men vulnerable to poor judgment." "I appreciate your concern," Everen replied carefully, settling into his chair and preparing for what was clearly going to be an unpleasant conversation. "Though I'm not aware of any particular poor judgment on my part." "Oh, but my dear man," Lord Pemberton interjected, his voice carrying the patronizing tone of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow child. "Surely you understand how your current charitable project appears to the outside world? A man of your age and position, spending so much time with a young woman of questionable background." "There's nothing questionable about Miss Hayes's background," Everen replied, his voice cooling considerably. "She's the daughter of honest people, and her character is beyond reproach." "I'm sure it is," Lady Pemberton said smoothly. "But character isn't the issue, is it? It's the appearance of impropriety that concerns your friends. People are talking, Everen. They're saying that grief has affected your judgment, that you're being taken advantage of by a clever young woman who understands exactly how to appeal to a lonely widower's sympathies." The accusation, delivered with such casual certainty, struck him like a physical blow. These people, who barely knew him and had never met Liora, felt qualified to pass judgment on motivations they couldn't possibly understand. "And what would you have me do?" he asked. "Abandon a promising young mind to ignorance because small-minded people might gossip?" "We would have you be realistic about your situation," Lord Pemberton replied bluntly. "You're 73 years old, with no heir and a substantial estate that will need proper management. This is the time to be thinking about your legacy, about ensuring your property passes to appropriate hands. Instead, you're wasting time and resources on a peasant girl who can never be anything more than what she was born to be." "What she was born to be," Everen repeated slowly, "was intelligent, curious, and capable of far more than her circumstances allowed. If that's not worth investing in, then what is?" Catherine Pemberton spoke for the first time, her voice thin and reedy. "But surely you see how this reflects on all of us. The county families have a responsibility to maintain certain standards. When one of our number behaves in ways that invite gossip and speculation, it affects everyone's reputation. The selfishness of the argument was breathtaking. They weren't concerned about his welfare or even about propriety in any meaningful sense. They were worried that his actions might somehow diminish their own social standing by association. "I see," Everen said quietly. "And what exactly do you propose I should do to address your concerns?" Lady Pemberton leaned forward with the expression of someone delivering a killing blow. "End this inappropriate relationship immediately. Send the girl away with a modest settlement, enough to ensure her gratitude and silence, but not so much as to encourage others to attempt similar manipulations. Then consider your real obligations. Catherine here is an accomplished young woman from an excellent family. A marriage alliance would secure your estate's future and restore your reputation simultaneously." The suggestion was so outrageous that Everen actually laughed, though there was no humor in the sound. "You're suggesting I marry your daughter to solve a social problem that exists only in the minds of gossips?" "I'm suggesting you fulfill your responsibilities to your class and your bloodline," Lord Pemberton said stiffly. "Catherine would make you an excellent wife, and any children from such a union would ensure the Ashworth name continues." Everen looked at Catherine, who was staring at her hands with obvious mortification. She was being offered like a broodmare to a man old enough to be her grandfather, and everyone in the room was pretending this was a reasonable proposition. "Miss Catherine," he said gently, "do you have any desire to marry a man of my age?" Her face flushed crimson, but she met his eyes with more courage than he had expected. "I would do my duty to my family," she said quietly, "but I confess the prospect holds little appeal for me personally." "Then we are in complete agreement," Everen replied, turning back to her parents. "I have no intention of marrying anyone, and I certainly won't end my friendship with Miss Hayes to satisfy the prejudices of people who have never bothered to understand the situation." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Lady Pemberton's mask of polite concern finally slipped, revealing the calculating hardness beneath. "Then you force us to take more direct action," she said coldly. "There are ways to protect the reputation of our community, even when individual members refuse to act responsibly. Social exclusion can be very effective in encouraging proper behavior." The threat was clear. Cross them, and he would find himself cut off from county society, his name associated with scandal and impropriety, wherever their influence extended. For a man whose identity had always been tied to his position in the social hierarchy, it should have been a devastating prospect. Instead, Everen felt something remarkably close to relief. If this was the price of supporting Liora's education, if this was what it cost to treat a deserving person with basic human dignity, then perhaps county society wasn't worth preserving. "I think," he said, rising from his chair with a finality that made his position clear, "that you've made your views abundantly plain. I appreciate you taking the time to share them with me." The dismissal was unmistakable. Lord Pemberton's face darkened with anger, while Lady Pemberton rose with the rigid dignity of someone who had been gravely insulted but refused to show it. "You'll regret this decision, Everen," she said as they moved toward the door. "Mark my words, this infatuation will end badly for everyone involved." After they left, Everen stood alone in the morning room, staring out the window toward the distant cottage where Liora was probably bent over her books, completely unaware of the forces gathering against her. The battle lines had been drawn, and he found himself on the side he had never expected to defend. But for the first time in years, he was absolutely certain he was fighting for something that mattered. The discovery came while Everen was searching through Marcus's belongings for a particular book on military history that Liora had expressed interest in reading. He had avoided this task for 3 years, unable to bear the emotional weight of handling his son's possessions. But his new sense of purpose had given him strength for difficult things. Marcus's room remained exactly as he had left it, bed-made. With military precision, books arranged alphabetically on the shelves. Personal items organized with the careful attention to detail that had marked his character. Everen moved slowly through the space, touching objects that carried the weight of memory. A compass Marcus had received for his 16th birthday, letters from Oxford friends, sketches of architectural improvements he had planned for the estate. Dotted was in the bottom drawer of Marcus's desk that Everen found the small wooden box, hidden beneath old examination papers and juvenile attempts at poetry. The box itself was unremarkable plain oak with simple brass hinges, but something about its concealed placement suggested it held secrets Marcus chosen not to share. Inside, wrapped in a piece of silk that had once been white but had yellowed with age, lay a marriage certificate. The paper was official, bearing the seal of St. Mary's Church in the village of Millbrook, some 20 miles from the estate. The date was 18 months before Marcus's departure for America, and the names written in careful script made Everen's hand shake as he read them. Marcus Jonathan Ashworth and Rose Elizabeth Fletcher. Fletcher. The name was familiar. Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned a young Mrs. Fletcher who had been struggling since her husband's death. But this couldn't be the same person. This certificate bore a different first name, and besides, it was impossible that Marcus could have married without his knowledge. Yet the document appeared genuine, complete with witness signatures and the nay. Rector's careful notation. Everen sank into Marcus's chair, staring at the certificate as if prolonged examination might reveal it to be some sort of elaborate forgery. But the paper was real. The ink had faded naturally, and the official seals showed no signs of tampering. Marcus had been married. Secretly married to a woman Everen had never met, never even heard mentioned. The son he thought he knew completely had maintained a deception of staggering proportions, carrying this secret right up to his departure for military service. But if Marcus had married, where was his wife? And more importantly, the thought struck him like lightning. Were there children? Everen's hands trembled as he searched through the box's remaining contents. There were letters, a dozen of them, written in a feminine hand and tied together with a faded blue ribbon. The paper was cheaper than what Marcus usually received, the writing careful but not entirely confident, suggesting someone of modest education writing to someone she feared might judge her efforts. "My dearest husband," the first letter began, and Everen's heart clenched at the tenderness in those simple words. "I know you think it best that we keep our marriage secret until you return from America, but it grows harder each day to pretend I am merely Rose Fletcher, spinster, when I am truly Rose Ashworth, your loving wife." The letters painted a picture of a young woman deeply in love with a man who had asked her to sacrifice the public acknowledgement of their union for reasons that grew less clear as Everen read on. Rose wrote of her work in the village bakery, of her small rooms above the shop, of her dreams for the life she and Marcus would build together when he returned from military service. But it was the final letter, dated just 3 months after Marcus's departure, that stopped Everen's breath. Entirely, "My beloved Marcus," it read, "I write with news that fills me with both joy and terror. I am with child, our child, and I pray daily that you will return safely to meet your son or daughter. I have not told anyone yet for fear of the scandal it would bring upon both our families. But I cannot bear this secret alone much longer. I dream of the day when we can live openly as husband and wife, when I can hold your child in the sunlight instead of hiding in shadows." The letter was dated nearly 2 years before Marcus's death. There had been time for a child to be born, time for that child to grow into a walking, talking person who carried Marcus's blood, Everen's legacy, in their veins. Everen set the letters aside with shaking hands and immediately rang for Mrs. Hartwell. She appeared within minutes, took one look at his pale face and the scattered papers, and quietly closed the door behind her. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, his voice hoarse with shock. "The Mrs. Fletcher you mentioned, who's been struggling. Rose Fletcher. Tell me about her. She's a sweet girl, my lord. Lost her husband to fever. 2 summers past. Been working at the bakery ever since to support herself." "Why do you ask? What did her husband look like?" "Do you remember?" Mrs. Hartwell frowned at the strange question. "I never met him, my lord. Rose came to the village after he died. Said she couldn't bear to stay in the place where they'd been. Happy together. She keeps very much to herself, works hard, causes no trouble. A bit sad, always, but grief as a way of marking people." "And she has no children?" "No, my lord." Mrs. Hartwell's frown deepened. Though there was talk when she first arrived, some said she looked like a woman who had recently been with child. But if there was a baby, it must have died. She never speaks of such things. Everen's heart hammered against his ribs. A woman who looked like she had recently given birth, arriving in a new village shortly after her husband's alleged death, which coincided almost exactly with Marcus's departure for America. A woman named Rose Fletcher, who had once been Rose Ashworth, secretly married to his son. "Mrs. Hartwell, I need you to arrange something for me immediately. I want to meet with Rose Fletcher, but privately. Can you think of a way to bring her here without causing gossip? She does fine needlework, my lord. I could ask her to come assess some mending that needs doing. The tapestries in the blue room have been wanting attention for months. Do it," Everen said, already moving toward the door. "This afternoon if possible." But as he waited for the meeting that might change everything, another thought struck him with crushing force. If Rose Fletcher was Marcus's widow, if there had been a child, where was that child now? The letter spoke of pregnancy. Mrs. Hartwell mentioned the appearance of recent childbirth, but there was no sign of a living grandchild. The possibility that he might have gained and lost an heir in the same moment was almost too cruel to contemplate. Yet he had to know the truth, whatever pain it might bring. 3 hours later, Rose Fletcher stood in his study, her hands twisting the fabric of her simple dress as she glanced nervously around the room. She was perhaps 25, with the kind of quiet prettiness that would have appealed to Marcus's gentle nature. Her eyes held the particular sadness of someone who had learned too young that life rarely kept its promises. "Mrs. Fletcher," Everen said softly, "please sit down. I have something to show you that may come as a shock." He placed the marriage certificate on the desk between them and watched as her face went through a series of transformations: surprise, recognition, fear, and finally a kind of desperate hope. "You know about the marriage," she whispered. "I've just discovered it. Rose, may I call you Rose? I need to ask you some very difficult questions, and I need you to answer them truthfully. Both our lives may depend on it." She nodded, her eyes never leaving the certificate. "Where is Marcus's child?" The question broke something inside her. She doubled over as if physically struck, and when she looked up at him, tears were streaming down her face. "Dead," she whispered. "Born too early, lived only 3 days. I held him. Marcus never even knew he had a son. The baby died before I could send word to America, and then Marcus died before I could write to tell him about either birth or death." The blow was devastating but not surprising. Everen had hoped but not expected to find a living grandchild. What he hadn't anticipated was the depth of his grief for this unknown child. This grandson he had never met, but who had carried the Ashworth blood for 3 precious days. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate for the magnitude of loss they were both feeling. Marcus never knew? Never knew he was married, never knew he was a father, never knew he had lost a child. Rose's voice broke on each revelation. "I tried to write, but how do you tell someone such things in a letter? I thought I would wait until he came home. Thought I would have time to explain everything face to face. And when he died, I had nothing left to connect me to him except grief. The marriage was secret. The child was dead. I was just another war widow with no proof, that I had ever been anything more. They sat in silence for several minutes, sharing the weight of losses that neither had been able to properly mourn. Marcus had died ignorant of the most important facts of his adult life, while Rose had borne the burden of those secrets alone. "Rose," Everen said finally, "you are my daughter-in-law, Marcus's widow. That makes you family, whether the world knows it or not." She looked at him with wonder, as if the concept of family was something she had forgotten could apply to her. "What does that mean?" she asked. "It means," Everen said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice, "that you have a place here for as long as you want it. It means that Marcus's family is still Marcus's family, blood or no blood. And it means that I have been given a second chance to honor my son's choices, even if I couldn't honor them while he was alive." The discovery changed everything and nothing. His blood heir was still gone. His direct lineage still ended with him. But Marcus had made choices about love and family that deserved to be respected. And Rose Fletcher, Rose Ashworth, deserved to be acknowledged as the widow of Lord Ashworth's son. More importantly, it crystallized something that had been growing in his mind for weeks. Family wasn't just about blood. Legacy wasn't just about inheritance. Sometimes the most important thing you could pass on was the simple recognition that people mattered, that their lives had value, that everyone deserved the chance to become who they were meant to be. He still had no heir. But perhaps, at 73, he was finally learning what that actually meant. The legal documents lay spread across Everen's desk like battle plans, each page representing another fortification in the war he was preparing to wage against convention, expectation, and the narrow-minded assumptions of his class. Mr. Whitmore, his solicitor for 30 years, sat across from him with the expression of a man watching a respected client commit professional suicide. "My lord," Whitmore said for the third time that morning, "I must strongly advise against this course of action. The legal challenges alone will be formidable, and the social consequences will be what they are," Everen interrupted, signing his name with deliberate care at the bottom of the will. "I'm not asking for your approval, Whitmore. I'm asking for your expertise in ensuring these documents will withstand any challenge my relatives might mount." The will was comprehensive and, Everen hoped, unassailable. It named Liora Hayes as his primary heir, inheriting not only the estate but also the title of landowner that came with it. There were provisions for Rose Fletcher as well, a substantial annuity and the right to live in the manor for as long as she chose, acknowledging her status as Marcus's widow. The distant relatives who had been circling like vultures received token amounts that would prevent them from claiming they had been forgotten, but nothing that would enable them to challenge the primary bequests. But the will was only part of what Everen had planned. More immediately dramatic was the formal adoption papers that would make Liora his legal daughter, giving her not just inheritance rights, but the social standing to defend those rights. It was an unprecedented step, a peer of the realm adopting a peasant woman. But precedent was exactly what Everen intended to shatter. The adoption alone will cause a scandal that will reverberate through London, Whitmore warned, removing his spectacles to clean them with nervous precision. Your peers will view it as an assault on the very foundations of the social order. Then, perhaps the social order needs assaulting, Everen replied, moving to the window where he could see the cottage where Margaret Hayes lay dying, and Liora continued her studies with fierce determination. A system that wastes human potential simply because of the circumstances of birth is not a system worth preserving. The irony was not lost on him that he was using his inherited privilege, the very power that came from birth rather than merit too, challenge the assumptions that privilege was based upon. But sometimes, he reflected, you had to use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. Margaret's condition had worsened dramatically over the past weeks. Dr. Morrison visited daily now, his face growing more grave with each examination. The stronger medicines he prescribed helped with her pain, but left her confused and often unable to follow conversations. Liora divided her time between continuing her studies and providing around-the-clock care, refusing offers of help with the stubborn independence that marked her character. "She won't leave her mother's side," Rose Fletcher had observed when she visited the cottage the previous afternoon. "I've offered to sit with Mrs. Hayes so Liora could rest, but she won't hear of it." Rose had integrated into their unconventional family with surprising ease, perhaps because her own experience with loss and social isolation had prepared her to value genuine connection over formal propriety. She and Liora had become close friends, bonded by their shared experience of loving men from different social worlds and by their mutual understanding of what it meant to exist between established categories. But Margaret's approaching death added urgency to Everen's legal preparations. Once she was gone, Liora would be entirely alone in the world, except for the family he was offering to create through adoption. The timing needed to be managed carefully. The legal proceedings would take weeks to complete, and he wanted everything finalized before the inevitable challenges began. The opposition was already organizing. 3 more letters had arrived from various relatives, each more strident than the last in its condemnation of his irrational infatuation and its warnings about the consequences of his actions. Lord Pemberton had visited again, this time bringing a magistrate friend who hinted darkly about mental incapacity proceedings if Everen persisted in his obviously deranged behavior. Most troubling was a visit from the bishop, a pompous man, who spoke at length about the sacred nature of social hierarchies and the danger of encouraging the lower classes to forget their proper station. The bishop had been particularly offensive in his characterization of Liora as a scheming adventuress who had seduced a grieving old man into abandoning his responsibilities to his class. "My lord," the bishop had said with unctuous concern, "surely you see that your charitable impulses, however well-intentioned, are being manipulated by someone who understands exactly how to exploit your generous nature? A woman of her background, however clever, cannot possibly understand the responsibilities that come with great wealth. You risk not only your own reputation, but the welfare of everyone who depends on your estate's proper management." Everen had listened to these criticisms with growing anger, not because they challenged his judgment, but because they revealed so clearly the assumptions that underpinned his world. Intelligence, character, and moral worth were apparently irrelevant if they appeared in someone born to the wrong circumstances. Only bloodline mattered. Only inherited position commanded respect. "Whitmore," he said now, returning to his desk and the documents that would formalize his rebellion against those assumptions. "How long before these papers can be filed and processed?" "The will can be executed immediately, of course, though. I recommend keeping its contents confidential until after your death to avoid unnecessary complications. The adoption proceedings will take several weeks. There are notifications to be made, hearings to attend, opportunities for objections to be raised. And what are the chances that the adoption will be approved despite those objections?" Whitmore was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his words. "In normal circumstances, I would say excellent. You are a man of sound mind disposing of your own property as you see fit, and Miss Hayes appears to be of good character. But these are not normal circumstances. The social pressure on the magistrates will be enormous. Men who might privately admire your choices will be reluctant to set legal precedents that could undermine the established order. Then, we need to make sure the legal arguments are so compelling that personal preferences become irrelevant," Everen said firmly. "What precedents exist for similar adoptions?" "Very few involving adults, and none involving such a significant difference in social station. We'll be asking the courts to recognize something that has never been done before." "Good," Everen replied, surprising his solicitor with his vehemence. "It's time something was done for the first time." That evening, Everen made the short walk to the cottage for what might be one of his final lessons with Liora. Margaret was sleeping, her breathing shallow and labored, while Liora sat beside the bed working by candlelight on a translation of Cicero that she was determined to complete despite the circumstances. "How is she?" he asked quietly, settling into his usual chair. "Dying," Liora replied with the direct honesty he had come to expect from her. "But peacefully, I think. She's been talking about my father today, seeing him in the shadows, speaking to him as if he were sitting right there. Dr. Morrison says it's the laudanum, but I think it's something more. I think she's preparing to join him." Everen studied Leora's face in the candlelight, noting the exhaustion around her eyes and the way her hands trembled slightly as she held her pen. She had been maintaining this vigil for weeks now, refusing all offers of help, determined to see her mother through to the end with the same fierce devotion she brought to everything she cared about. "Liora," he said carefully, "I have something important to discuss with you, something that will affect both our futures." She set down her pen and gave him her complete attention, the same quality of focus she brought to her studies. "What is it? I want to adopt you as my legal daughter." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Liora's expression went through several rapid changes: surprise, confusion, something that might have been hope. Then, a careful neutrality that suggested she was thinking through implications he might not have considered. "Why?" she asked finally. "Because I've come to love you like a daughter," he said simply. "Because you've brought meaning back to my life when I thought it was finished. Because you deserve a family that values you, and I deserve a child who will carry on the values I hold most dear. But I'm not your blood. Neither was Rose, until Marcus married her. Blood isn't the only thing that creates family, Liora. Sometimes the bonds we choose are stronger than the ones we inherit." She was quiet for several minutes, her gaze moving between her sleeping mother and the legal documents he had brought. When she spoke, her voice was steady but emotional. "What would this mean, practically? I would be Lady Liora Ashworth. You would be my heir in every legal sense. The estate would pass to you, along with the responsibilities that come with it. You would have the social standing to defend your position against any challenges, and the resources to use your intelligence for whatever purposes you choose. And the scandal?" Everen couldn't help but smile at her directness. "Will be considerable. My relatives are already organizing opposition, and half the county believes I've lost my mind. But scandal fades, Liora. Character endures. I need to think about this," she said, then looked toward her mother's still form. After Mama is gone, I'll give you my answer." But they both knew Margaret Hayes didn't have days left, perhaps not even hours. As if summoned by their conversation about endings, Dr. Morrison arrived just past midnight with the grave expression they had all been dreading. "I'm afraid it won't be much longer," he said after his examination. "Her breathing is becoming more labored, and she's no longer responding to external stimuli. It's time to prepare for the end." Liora nodded with the composure of someone who had been preparing for this moment for months. "Should I wake her to say goodbye?" "She can probably hear you even if she can't respond," Dr. Morrison replied gently. "Speak to her as if she's listening, because in some way she almost certainly is." Everen withdrew to give them privacy, but not before he heard Liora begin to speak in the clear, strong voice that had first drawn his attention all those weeks ago. "Mama," she said, taking her mother's hand, "I want you to know that everything you taught me is still alive in my heart. The love, the dignity, the determination to find beauty even in difficult circumstances, all of it lives on in me. And I want you to know that you don't need to worry about my future anymore. Lord Everen has offered to adopt me, to make me his daughter and heir. I'll have family and education and the chance to do something meaningful with my life. You can rest now, knowing that your work is finished and it was done well. Margaret Hayes died just before dawn, slipping away so quietly that for several minutes Liora didn't realize she was gone. When she did, she didn't weep or cry out. She simply sat holding her mother's hand, whispering the words of the old prayer book that had comforted generations of women before her. Everen handled the funeral arrangements with the same care he had given to Eleanor's burial 15 years earlier, ensuring that Margaret Hayes was laid to rest with dignity and respect despite her humble circumstances. The service was well attended, drawing not only the villagers who had known her, but also several members of the gentry, who came more from curiosity about Everen's project than from genuine mourning. 3 days after the funeral, Liora gave him her answer. "Yes," she said simply, standing in the cottage that was now empty except for the memories it held. "I accept your offer with gratitude and the promise that I will try to be worthy of the trust you're placing in me." "You already are," Everen replied, embracing her for the first time as the father she had chosen and the daughter he had never expected to find. The legal proceedings began immediately, and with them, the battle for the future of everything Everen held dear. The courtroom in Nobility was packed beyond capacity, with spectators spilling out into the corridor and gathering in the square outside to await news of the most scandalous legal proceeding the county had seen in decades. Lord Everen Ashworth, 70th Earl of Thornfield, was attempting to adopt a peasant woman as his heir, a case that had drawn attention from as far away as London and set the local gentry buzzing with outrage and fascination in equal measure. Everen sat at the petitioner's table with Mr. Whitmore and their carefully assembled collection of documents, trying to project the calm confidence of a man certain of his position. Beside him, Liora wore her finest dress, still simple by the standards of the room's other occupants, but spotlessly clean and worn with the dignity that had first caught his attention months ago. Her hands were folded in her lap, her posture erect, her expression composed despite the hostile stares directed toward her from every corner of the packed chamber. Across the aisle sat the opposition, a formidable array of legal talent funded by his distant relatives and coordinated by his pompous cousin Reginald. They had engaged Mr. Hartwell, no relation to his housekeeper, widely considered the finest barrister in 3 counties, along with 2 junior counsel and a clerk whose sole job seemed to be carrying increasingly thick files of precedents and objections. The presiding magistrate was Sir Edmund Blackstone, a man Everen had known socially for 20 years, but who now regarded him from the bench with the neutral expression required by judicial propriety. Blackstone was known for his fairness, but also for his deep respect for tradition and established order. The outcome would likely depend on which principle he valued more highly, legal precedent or social stability. "This court is now in session," Blackstone announced, bringing the packed room to immediate attention. "We are here to consider the petition of Lord Everen Ashworth for the legal adoption of Miss Liora Hayes, an adult woman currently residing on the petitioner's estate. Mr. Whitmore, you may present your client's case." Whitmore rose with the measured dignity of a man who had practiced law for 4 decades. He was not a dramatic speaker. His strength lay in methodical reasoning and unassailable logic rather than rhetorical flourish. But Everen had chosen him precisely because this case would be won or lost on legal merit, not emotional appeal. "Your Honor," Whitmore began, "my client seeks nothing more than the legal recognition of a relationship that already exists in fact. Miss Hayes has resided in Lord Ashworth's household, received his paternal guidance, and been treated in all respects as his daughter for the better part of a year. The adoption he seeks merely formalizes what natural affection and mutual consent have already established." The argument was careful and conservative, grounding Everen's unprecedented request in familiar legal concepts. But Everen could see from the expressions in the gallery that the social implications of the case weighed more heavily in most minds than the legal technicalities. "Furthermore," Whitmore continued, English law has always recognized the right of property owners to dispose of their assets as they see fit, provided they are of sound mind and their decisions harm no legitimate interests of others. Lord Ashworth is demonstrably competent. Miss Hayes is of impeccable character, and no party is standing to claim injury from this arrangement. Mr. Whitmore, Sir Edmund interrupted. Surely you acknowledge that adoption is intended to serve the best interests of children who lack parental care. Miss Hayes is a grown woman who has never been under your client's guardianship. What legal precedent supports such an unusual application of adoption law? It was the question they had known would come, and Whitmore was ready for it. Your Honor, while adult adoptions are uncommon, they are not unknown in English law. The case of Pembroke v. Pembroke established that adoption serves not only the welfare of children, but the creation of legal family relationships that reflect existing emotional bonds. The age of the adoptee is less relevant than the genuine nature of the familial relationship being formalized. From the opposition table, Mr. Hartwell rose with the confident bearing of a man who had identified his opponent's weakness. He was younger than Whitmore, more theatrical in his presentation, and clearly relishing the opportunity to argue such a high-profile case. Your Honor, Hartwell said, my learned colleague would have this court believe that Lord Ashworth's infatuation with a young woman of questionable background represents the same natural affection that binds parent to child. But the evidence suggests something far more troubling: the manipulation of an elderly man's loneliness by someone who understood exactly how to exploit his emotional vulnerabilities. The attack was direct and brutal, designed to portray Liora as a scheming adventuress who had seduced a grieving widower into abandoning his responsibilities to his class. Everen felt his anger rise, but Whitmore had warned him that such accusations were inevitable and that his reaction would be carefully watched by everyone in the courtroom. Consider the facts, Hartwell continued, warming to his theme. Lord Ashworth discovers this woman living illegally on his property, takes pity on her circumstances, and within months finds himself so thoroughly under her influence that he proposes to make her his primary heir. What rational explanation exists for such extraordinary generosity towards someone he had never met before this year? Objection, Your Honor, Whitmore interjected. Counsel is arguing motive rather than law, and doing so without evidence beyond his own speculation. Sustained, Sir Edmund ruled. Mr. Hartwell, please confine your arguments to legal grounds for opposing this petition. But Hartwell had accomplished his purpose. He had planted the suggestion that the entire relationship was based on manipulation, rather than genuine affection. Now he shifted to more technical arguments, challenging the precedents Whitmore had cited and questioning whether existing adoption law could be stretched to cover such unusual circumstances. The precedents my colleague cites involve family members formalizing existing relationships, uncles adopting orphan nephews, grandparents assuming legal guardianship of grandchildren. They do not support the adoption of a complete stranger, regardless of whatever emotional attachment may have developed between the parties. The legal arguments continued for hours, with each side citing cases and precedents while the packed courtroom listened with the attention of spectators at a theatrical performance. But Everen knew that the real battle was not being fought in legal technicalities. It was being waged in the minds of everyone present, who would decide whether his relationship with Liora represented something admirable or something shameful. As the afternoon wore on, witnesses were called to testify about Liora's character and her relationship with Everen. Mrs. Hartwell spoke movingly about the young woman's devotion to her dying mother and her genuine dedication to learning. Dr. Morrison testified about her intelligence and moral character. Rose Fletcher, appearing publicly as Marcus's widow for the first time, described the dignity with which Liora had faced grief and uncertainty. But the opposition had witnesses too. Lord Pemberton testified about the unseemly nature of the relationship and its potential for encouraging social unrest among the lower classes. Lady Pemberton spoke with icy propriety about the damage such precedents might do to proper family structures. Two other landowners offered similar testimony about the dangerous implications of allowing peasants to inherit noble estates. The testimony revealed more about the witnesses than about the facts they purported to describe. Those who had taken the trouble to know Liora spoke of her character and capabilities. Those who opposed the adoption on principle had never bothered to meet her, basing their objections entirely on her social origins. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, Sir Edmund announced that he would hear final arguments the following morning before rendering his decision. The courtroom emptied slowly, with knots of spectators lingering to discuss what they had witnessed and debate the likely outcome. "How do you think we did?" Liora asked quietly as they prepared to leave. "We presented our case as well as it could be presented," Whitmore replied carefully. "But legal merit isn't the only factor at work here. Sir Edmund is under enormous pressure from his social equals to reject the petition, regardless of its legal validity." "Then we may lose," she said. Without self-pity, simply acknowledging a possibility they all understood. "We may," Everen agreed. "But we've forced them to articulate their objections publicly, to defend their assumptions about worth and merit in open court. Whatever happens tomorrow, we've shown that these questions can be challenged." That night, as Everen sat in his study, preparing for whatever the morning might bring, he reflected on how much had changed since he first discovered Liora in her humble cottage. Win or lose, the legal proceedings had crystallized something important about the nature of family, legacy, and the values worth fighting for. Tomorrow would determine whether English law was ready to recognize what his heart had known for months, that the bonds of chosen family could be as strong and legitimate as those determined by accident of birth. The second day of proceedings began with an unexpected development that sent a ripple of whispers through the packed courtroom. Sir Edmund had summoned additional witnesses, village residents, who had not appeared on either side's official list, but whom he wished to hear from directly before rendering his decision. This court recognizes that adoption proceedings, particularly those involving adults, must consider not only the law, but the impact such decisions might have on the community, Sir Edmund announced. "Therefore, I am exercising my discretion to hear testimony from those who have observed the relationship in question and can speak to its genuine nature." The first witness called was Thomas Fletcher, the village baker and Rose's employer. He was a practical man in his 50s, weathered by years of hard work, but possessed of the straightforward honesty that came from dealing with people from all walks of life. "Mr. Fletcher," Sir Edmund said, "you have observed Miss Hayes in your village. What is your assessment of her character?" "She's good people, Your Honor," Fletcher replied in his thick local accent. "Works hard, treats everyone with respect, never puts on airs despite all the learning she's been getting. When my Rose was struggling after we learned about her situation, Miss Hayes was the first to offer friendship without asking questions or passing judgment." "And what is your opinion of her relationship with Lord Ashworth?" Fletcher was quiet for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. "I've seen them together in the village, Your Honor, when he comes to visit my Rose or when they walk to church together. They talk like family, not like some old fool and a young woman trying to flatter him, but like a father and daughter who enjoy each other's company. She challenges him when she thinks he's wrong, and he listens to her opinions, like they matter. That's how real families behave." The testimony was devastating to the opposition's case because it came from someone with no stake in the outcome, a working man whose observations carried the weight of daily experience rather than social theory. Next came Mrs. Whitmore, wife of the village parson, who had taught Liora to read as a child. Her testimony was particularly powerful because it established Liora's character and intelligence as existing. long before she had met Everen. "Miss Hayes was the brightest child I ever attempted to teach," she said firmly. "Quick to learn, thoughtful in her questions, and possessed of a moral seriousness that was remarkable in someone so young. I always regretted that her circumstances prevented her from receiving the education her mind deserved. Lord Ashworth has simply provided what should have been available to her from birth." But it was when Sir Edmund called Liora herself to testify that the courtroom fell into complete silence. She rose from her seat with quiet dignity, walked to the witness stand, and faced the packed room with the same composure she had shown throughout the proceedings. "Miss Hayes," Sir Edmund said, "this court needs to understand your motivations in accepting Lord Ashworth's offer of adoption. Are you seeking financial advantage, social advancement, or something else entirely?" Liora was quiet for a moment, her gaze moving across the hostile faces in the gallery before settling on Sir Edmund's attentive expression. "Your Honor," she said, her clear voice carrying to every corner of the room, "I spent the first 25 years of my life believing that intelligence and character were luxuries I couldn't afford, that survival required accepting limitations imposed by circumstances I had no power to change. Lord Ashworth showed me that those beliefs were wrong, that the accident of birth need not determine the boundaries of possibility." She paused, and Everen could see her drawing on the philosophical training they had worked on together during their months of study. "But this proceeding isn't really about me," she continued. "It's about whether we believe that worth is inherited or earned, whether family is defined by blood or by love, whether society benefits more from preserving old inequities or from recognizing new possibilities. Lord Ashworth has offered me not just inheritance, but acknowledgement, the recognition that my life has value beyond the circumstances of my birth." "And what do you intend to do with the position he is offering you?" Sir Edmund asked. "Use it to create opportunities for others," Liora replied without hesitation. "The same gift of education and recognition that Lord Ashworth has given me. If I inherit his estate, I intend to establish schools for children whose intelligence is currently wasted because of their social station. I want to prove that expanding opportunity strengthens rather than threatens the social order." The answer clearly surprised many in the courtroom, including some of the opposition witnesses who had assumed her motivations were entirely selfish. The idea that she might use her position to benefit others rather than simply enjoy its privileges had apparently not occurred to them. Mr. Hartwell rose for cross-examination with less confidence than he had shown the previous day. Liora's testimony had been both articulate and compelling, making it difficult to portray her as the scheming adventuress his case required. "Miss Hayes," he began carefully, "you speak of creating opportunities for others, but surely you understand that such radical changes to established social structures could lead to dangerous unrest. What gives you the right to impose your social theories on an established community?" It was a clever question, designed to make her sound either naive or presumptuous. But Liora had spent months discussing exactly these kinds of moral and political questions with Everen, and she was ready for the challenge. "I have no right to impose anything on anyone," she replied calmly. "But I do have the right to use whatever resources come into my possession in ways that reflect my values. If those values include believing that education and opportunity should be based on merit rather than birth, then I will act accordingly. Others are free to disagree and to use their own resources differently. But don't you see that your very presence here challenges the natural order that has maintained social stability for centuries?" "I see that I challenge assumptions about that order," Liora replied, her voice growing stronger. "But if stability requires accepting that intelligence and character have no value when they appear in the wrong circumstances, then perhaps that stability is less valuable than the changes that might replace it." The exchange continued for several more minutes, with Hartwell growing increasingly frustrated as his attempts to rattle Liora failed to dent her composed confidence. She answered each question thoughtfully, never claiming more than she could support, but never backing down from the principles that had brought her to this moment. When she finally returned to her seat, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted perceptibly. Whatever the ultimate outcome of the case, she had demonstrated that she was not the ignorant peasant her opponents had assumed her to be. Final arguments were brief, with both sides summarizing positions that had been thoroughly aired over 2 days of testimony. But the real conclusion came when Sir Edmund called for a brief recess to consider his decision. "This case presents questions that go beyond the specific petition before me," he said when court reconvened an hour later. "It asks whether our legal system can accommodate relationships that don't fit traditional categories, whether family can be defined by choice rather than birth, and whether social mobility should be regulated by law or left to individual conscience." The courtroom was completely silent now, every person present understanding that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered long after the immediate participants were gone. After careful consideration of the evidence and arguments presented, Sir Edmund continued, "I find that the petitioner has met the legal requirements for adoption. Lord Ashworth is of sound mind, Miss Hayes is of good character, and the relationship they seek to formalize appears to be based on genuine mutual affection rather than improper motives." A gasp went up from the gallery, followed immediately by angry murmurs from the opposition section and relieved sighs from Everen's supporters. "However," Sir Edmund continued, raising his voice to restore order, "I am also mindful that this decision sets a precedent that could have far-reaching social implications. Therefore, I am granting the petition with the condition that Miss Hayes demonstrate her fitness for the responsibilities she will inherit by successfully managing a portion of the estate for a probationary period of 1 year." It was a compromise that gave both sides something to claim as victory while ensuring that the ultimate test would be practical rather than theoretical. If Liora could prove her capabilities as a landowner and employer, then her legitimacy as Everen's heir would be established beyond question. As the courtroom erupted in excited conversation, Everen reached for Leora's hand and felt her fingers close around his with quiet strength. "We did it," she whispered. Though whether she was addressing him or her absent mother, he couldn't be sure. "No," he replied, squeezing her hand gently as they prepared to leave the courtroom that had just transformed them from strangers into legal family. "We did it." Outside the courthouse, a small crowd had gathered to witness their emergence as father and daughter. Some faces showed hostility, others curiosity, but many displayed something that looked remarkably like approval. Whatever the future might hold, they had won the right to face it together. 5 years later, Lord Everen Ashworth stood in the memorial garden that Liora had created in the place where her mother's cottage had once stood. The humble structure had been carefully dismantled, and its materials used to build the first of 3 schools now operating on the estate. But the garden preserved the memory of where everything had begun. Margaret Hayes's grave was marked by a simple stone bearing words that Liora had chosen. "She taught me that love is the only wealth that grows when shared." The garden itself had become a place of quiet pilgrimage for families throughout the county. Parents brought children here to hear the story of how a peasant woman's daughter had become a lady through education and character, how an old lord had found his true legacy in chosen family rather than blood inheritance. The tale had grown in the telling, of course, acquiring embellishments that made it more fairy tale than history. But the essential truth remained unchanged. Sometimes the most important things in life come from the most unexpected places. Everen was 78 now, his hair completely white and his steps slower than they had once been. But his mind remained sharp and his purpose clear. The probationary year that Sir Edmund had imposed had passed so successfully that even Leora's harshest critics had been forced to acknowledge her competence. She had managed the estate's finances with careful attention to both profit and responsibility. had improved working conditions for the tenants without compromising productivity, and had begun the educational programs that were already showing remarkable results. The first graduating class from the estate school had produced 2 students who earned places at Oxford, 3 who became teachers in neighboring villages, and a dozen others who went on to skilled trades and professional positions that would have been impossible under the old system. Critics who had predicted social chaos from educating the lower classes found themselves confronted with evidence that education actually created more stability, not less. The roses are particularly beautiful this year, Rose Fletcher, now Rose Ashworth, having finally agreed to use her legal married name, said as she joined him in the garden. She carried a basket of cut flowers intended for the manor's dinner table, where she would be joining Everen and Liora for their weekly family meal. Rose had thrived in her new circumstances, finding in the acknowledgement of her marriage to Marcus a peace she had thought lost forever. She managed the household with quiet efficiency, served as Liora's closest advisor and confidant, and had become the anchor of the unconventional family they had created from loss and hope. Liora has her mother's gift for growing things, Everen replied, watching as his adopted daughter worked with a group of village children to plant new bulbs that would bloom the following spring. At 30, she had grown into her role as the estate's future mistress with a grace that would have impressed even her early critics. Her marriage to Dr. Morrison 2 years previous had sealed her acceptance in local society while providing her with a partner who shared her commitment to social progress. The children clustered around her were part of the afternoon education program she had established for those whose families needed them to work during regular school hours. They came to the estate after their chores were finished, eager to learn reading and arithmetic from the lady who had once been a peasant child herself. Their parents, initially suspicious of education that might make their children dissatisfied with their station, had come to see the value in children who could read contracts and calculate fair prices. Lady Liora, one of the youngest children, called out, holding up a bulb with obvious pride, "Will this one grow as big as the others?" "Bigger, perhaps," Liora replied, kneeling to examine the child's work. The smallest seeds sometimes produce the most beautiful flowers if they're planted in good soil and tended with care. The exchange might have been a metaphor for everything they had accomplished, Everen reflected. The social experiment that had begun with a chance encounter at a humble cottage had grown into something that was changing not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone around them. As the afternoon light began to fade and the children departed for their homes, Liora made her way across the garden to where Everen and Rose were sitting on the bench he had installed beneath the old oak tree. "Dr. Morrison sends his regrets," she said, settling beside them with the easy familiarity of someone who had never forgotten her humble origins despite her elevated circumstances. "He's attending a difficult birth in the village. The mother is very young, 16, perhaps an unmarried. He wanted to be certain she received proper care regardless of her circumstances." It was exactly the sort of situation that would have created scandal in the old days, when unwed mothers were left to face their difficulties alone. But Liora's influence had gradually changed attitudes throughout the estate, creating an environment where compassion took precedence over judgment. "Will they need assistance?" Everen asked. "I've already arranged for Mrs. Patterson to provide household help for the first month, and will ensure the baby has everything necessary. The girl has family, but they're struggling themselves. A little support now will prevent larger problems later." The practical wisdom of the approach impressed him, as did the way Liora had learned to exercise her authority quietly, effectively, and always with attention to human dignity rather than social conventions. She had become exactly the kind of leader he had hoped to raise Marcus to be, someone who understood that power was meant to serve rather than dominate. "I have news," Rose said, producing a letter from her basket with the slightly embarrassed air of someone sharing a secret. From London? It seems our little revolution has attracted attention in rather exalted circles. The letter bore an impressive seal that Everen recognized immediately. It was from the Duchess of Marlborough, one of the most influential women in English society and a notable advocate for women's education. "My dear Lady Ashworth," Rose read aloud, "I write to express my admiration for the progressive programs you have established on your estate. The reports I have received suggest that your schools are producing remarkable results while maintaining social stability, a combination that many believed impossible. I would be honored to visit your estate at your convenience to observe these innovations firsthand, as I am considering similar programs on my own properties." The letter went on to request detailed information about curricula, funding, and administration, clearly indicating that Liora's work was being studied as a potential model for broader social reform. "The Duchess of Marlborough," Everen said with wonder. "When I offered you an education all those years ago, I never imagined it would lead to this." "Neither did I," Liora admitted, folding the letter carefully. "Sometimes I feel like I'm living someone else's life, that surely the peasant girl, who once worried about having enough to eat, couldn't have become someone whose opinions mattered to duchesses." "But you are that same person," Rose pointed out gently. "You've simply been allowed to become who you were always meant to be. The circumstances changed, not your essential character." As evening settled over the estate and they prepared to return to the manor for dinner, Everen felt the particular satisfaction that comes from a life well lived. He had not achieved immortality through bloodline, had not passed on the Ashworth name to future generations of his own blood, but he had created something more valuable, a legacy of opportunity, a demonstration that worth was earned rather than inherited, and a family built on love rather than genetics. The empty picture frame that had once sat on his study desk now held a portrait of his chosen family himself. Liora, Rose, and Dr. Morrison, painted by a local artist on the occasion of Liora's marriage. It was not the legacy he had expected, but it was infinitely more meaningful than the one he had lost as they walked toward the manor through the gathering dusk. Liora slipped her arm through his with the natural affection of a daughter who had never forgotten that she was loved by choice rather than obligation. "Thank you," she said simply, words that had been spoken between them countless times, but never lost their power. "No," Everen replied, patting her hand with the gentle authority of a father whose greatest pride was seeing his child surpass his expectations. "Thank you." The manor windows glowed with warm light ahead of them, promising the family dinner that had become the anchor of their shared life. In the distance, the lights of tenant cottages dotted the landscape, each representing a life touched by the changes they had wrought together. And in the memorial garden behind them, Margaret Hayes rested in soil that had been transformed from a place of endings into a place of beginnings. The Ashworth legacy would indeed continue, not through blood, but through the countless lives that had been changed by the radical proposition that all people possessed worth regardless of the circumstances of their birth. It was a legacy that would outlast any title, any estate, any monument carved in stone. It was a legacy written in human hearts and therefore truly eternal.